G'day folks, ZiggyD here. I played the Diablo 4 beta this weekend, rogue so far to max level, and did most of what you can do in the beta. Being a beta and only a slice of the first part of the game, I can only really share my thoughts within that context, but it's certainly enough to start a discussion of whether Diablo 4 is shaping up to be any good. Now, worth mentioning is that the game launches in a bit over 2 months, so in game development timelines, what we're seeing here is pretty close to the final product. Major core system changes and overhauls to more fundamental systems are pretty unlikely at this point. More likely is that we'll see a bunch of bug fixes and balanced tuning, things that involve adjusting some numbers. That said, it's still worth critiquing core systems and major stuff here that's unlikely to change, because my main obligation is not to give the developers helpful feedback, but rather to give you some insights into whether the game might be worth your $100. So let's start with the visuals. Many of the environments and details, in particular things like homes and dungeons, are stunning, and they feel lovingly crafted. They kind of look like hand-painted, high-quality Dungeons & Dragons tabletop miniatures, little dioramas almost. There's more detail and grit here than Blizzard usually has. It's a bit of a departure from their recent visual styles, and a decent step up from Diablo 3. Overall, environments are really charming. Character armor models and visual customization are also excellent. For the most part, animations look great too. Enemy models and designs are also awesome overall. They look great and they move well. I can't really comment on skill effects that much though, because as someone who mained Rogue, they basically don't exist, but more about Rogue later. Story cutscenes I'll not show to avoid spoilers, but I will comment on them. Cinematic cutscenes are better than ever. There was one really incredible one at the start of the game. The rest of the time, however, there were in-engine cutscenes. Some were good, especially major ones featuring Lilith, but most were jittering and stilted for some reason. I don't know if it's just performance issues. Now, if you're watching this video or streams of the game and thinking that it doesn't look very good, then that's understandable. There's two things going on there. The higher detail level does get lost in the encoding on streams and video, but the main problem is the fog, glare, and blizzard effects. These really make the game look quite washed out at times, which looks pretty bad in game sometimes, but it looks far worse on video. It is kind of cool to have a raging blizzard from time to time for immersion's sake, but sometimes you're inside and the effects are still making everything hard to see. It'd be nice if things at least looked a lot clearer indoors when you're inside and there shouldn't be a blizzard blowing through there. It's hard to appreciate the gorgeous set designs when you can hardly see all of that detail. Another big letdown on the visual side of things is the user interface. Overall, it looks quite bad in some ways that I can't quite put my finger on. It's blandly grey, and it looks quite similar to a lot of mobile action RPGs that I've seen. There's also a lot of large text overlay pop-ups, sometimes in the middle of combat too, which are very mobile gaming and definitely detract from the experience. As an aside, the UI functionality is also not great too. Menus are a bit obtuse and difficult to navigate, and there's no proper overlay map, only a full screen menu map which stops you from seeing the game and the enemies attacking you. On the audio side of things, it's quite good overall. Even really basic skills sound good, though there is some audio balancing issues with some skills being way louder than others. A lot of the voice acting is great too. Music is very taste-based, of course, but after a few hours I found a lot of the violin noodling to be quite annoying, and I quite like violin usually. Alright, so let's talk a bit about the world, the exploration, and a bit on the MMO features. Diablo 4 is an online MMO-ish game. There are other players running around, though that number is about a dozen or so, and it's a heavily instanced game. There's not hundreds of people in one zone, for example. Now, you cannot opt out of this MMO system. There will always be other players around, it's always online. Now, this does mean that you can be talking to an NPC in town or immersing yourself in the scenery while someone spins around and spams emotes. That person is often me. Also, every time I go into my private bedroom, there is someone else in there. I guess the way the economy is going at the moment, every player has to share a single bedroom in this game. Now, you don't run into people in the overworlds that often because they're quite large, but when it does happen, it often caught me off guard because I'd be doing a side quest or something and some barbarian just spins across my screen going, wee! But back on topic, the world and zones take their cues from MMOs like Lost Ark. There's a lot of big, wide, open areas with lots of running and sometimes not a lot of monsters or anything else in them. Quite often, I just spam movement skills for a minute or so, traveling to my next quest or dungeon. You're supposed to get horses, which should help, but you don't get them until after the beta content apparently, which is potentially many hours of running around big old overworld zones. I don't know why you don't get access to a horse in the first town. I don't know, maybe they're not finished or something. Scattered around the world are some random events. Most of these are kill monsters attacking carts for a couple of items and some zone completion points. Some of them are a little bit more interesting though. They can at least break up the running from time to time. A huge focus of the gameplay, where most of the progression seems to happen, is the dungeons. From these you unlock important gear crafting options to customize your skills, and many side and main quests happens inside of these dungeons. Most of these dungeons are visually gorgeous and involve killing monsters until you hit a locked door or a thing that you then have to fetch 2 or 3 things and put them on plinths to unlock the door or locked thing so that you can fight the boss. Sometimes there's an extra zone, which usually has you have to kill every single enemy in the zone, which I hate, as you miss that one guy at the start and you have to run all the way back. Now, all of the dungeons are like this, some variation on this same concept. There is a lot of backtracking overall, though at least the map design team put in some alternate paths to backtrack so that you can fight or dodge monsters on the way back. Honestly, there's a lot of complaining about this dungeon system, but I don't hate it. They are effectively just procedural maps with a couple of checkpoints. It's not that different. The problem is that you do dozens of these, and I saw the same bosses and the same layouts many times, and I think that's going to potentially become a problem. I've also heard secondhand from some closed beta testers that the endgame system is based on these dungeons with extra difficulty mods added on top, which means you'll be doing hundreds of these, if not thousands of these at endgame. Now, I'm sure there will be more bosses and layouts by endgame, but if you don't like the dungeon design in the beta, be aware that you're going to be doing a lot of them as you progress and at endgame. It's a big portion of the gameplay. For the rest of the exploration, there's a bunch of shrines to Lilith to click and some really boring cellars to clear out, which will contribute to a zone completion score. This is great if you're the type of player who likes collecting all the Pinecones and 100%ing things, but not so great if you don't like doing that. Especially as there are some rather important rewards for zone rep grinding, such as skill points and potion slots. Speaking of potions, the game has 30-minute buff elixirs that give XP and other boosts. I hate this sort of thing. I don't know why you would include such chores in a game. I suspect it's just to justify the MMO-ish herb collection that you can do in the overworld, which I'm also not a big fan of. Anyway, let's talk about that world boss. If you don't want to see it, then skip this section of the video. There's no story aspects to the world boss, just the visuals of the world boss itself, but that in itself might be a spoiler for you. So, in the beta, there's a world boss, a huge boss tuned to be fought by basically all of the players in your instance. It's on a schedule and appeared, I think it was about 4 times over the weekend. The actual fight itself was okay. It's kind of a one-shotsville sort of fight, but you can learn the attacks and avoid them with a bit of practice for the most part. It's certainly easier to contribute to the fight with ranged skills than in melee. Poor barbarians. Sorcerers would just sit 2 screens away and let hydras kill the boss off screen, while the barbarians pretend to be lunch. It's a good spectacle, but overall, it's simpler boss design than most of the normal bosses in the game. Overall, this seems fine for a first world boss. I don't expect it to be super complex or anything, assuming that later ones are a bit more interesting. The loot was pretty solid for my kill. My biggest issue by far with this whole world boss system, though, is that it's on a timer. The boss spawns at set times of the day. If you're asleep, at work, or spending some time with family, then tough luck. It's the worst part of MMOs added to Diablo, the sort of design that says, you schedule your life based around the game, for the game is more important. I get the idea, it's to build a sense of community, to get everyone working together on something as a group at the same time. But it's such a boring way of achieving that goal. A far cooler idea would be something like this. What if to summon the world boss, you had to break the 8 seals binding their mortal form? Breaking the seals means killing certain enemies, completing certain events, and killing various mini-bosses in the zone. As the seals are broken, players are notified a seal has been broken, and they can choose to help free the world boss, or they can do other things and pop by to fight the boss when the final seal is broken. With a system like this, the boss is not on a schedule, but rather spawned through player action. Community is built not only through the fight, but also all the activities leading up to the fight, and a player who wants to play on their own schedule can try and work on breaking the seals on their own and get their friends to help them out so that they can fight the boss. The other side of the problem here is that the world bosses have a timer until they just leave. If your instance has lower level or weaker players, or if people just don't show up to the world boss, it just leaves and you get nothing. Imagine after hours of waiting or staying up late to be online for that world boss spawn that's in a different time zone. and then just that happens. I don't really get the point of the fail timer at all. If you need a fail state, have something like if you die 10 times and your gear breaks, you're done and you can't fight it anymore, or something like that, but not just have the boss log out after 15 minutes. Better yet, have the boss fight till it's dead, but have some sort of degrees of failure system that lowers reward. Like, for example, the longer the boss stays alive, the more peasant villages it squashes, which cuts into your pay. I actually like the idea of world bosses, but I think it could be executed a lot better here. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about Rogue, the class I played this beta. I have never in my life seen such a mundane set of basic, samey skills. I love the Rogue, Assassin, Amazon, or Ranger style classes, but Diablo 4's Rogue is so very disappointing. So I'm using Flurry as my main skill. It's a rapid series of stabs. Let's have a look at some of the other options. How about Barrage with the bow? What's that look like? It seems familiar, doesn't it? It's just a ranged version of Flurry. Okay, sure. What about Rapid Fire? It's the same skill, but more accurate. Okay, what about the final primary bow skill option? It's just an arrow that pierces. So you have inaccurate arrows, accurate arrows, or an arrow that pierces. Those are your options. The basic skills are arrow, arrow that homes in a little bit, stab, or another stab that lets you walk through enemies afterwards. The best of the basic skills is one that lets you throw 3 daggers. Each skill has some minor differences in whether they crit a bit more or whether they apply vulnerability, and some of them get a ricochet or a pierce chance, but that's it. Where's the exploding throwing daggers, the burning arrows, the poison exploding arrows, anything interesting? I swear it's like they tried to make the Rogue realistic, which is never something I would have ever considered in an action RPG as being a priority. It's a huge step back from Diablo 3's Demon Hunter, which had strafe, entangling shot, bowlers, elemental arrows, ballista sentries, and cluster bombs. Even Diablo 2's Amazon had more variety with a mixture of elemental and explosive arrows in addition to normal multi-shots and barrages. Things do get a little bit better once you get Poison Trap and Caltrops. These give you some fun utility and mobility. You've also got Infusions, which add some damage and small extra effect to a couple of attacks, but those are pretty minimal in terms of gameplay impact. And then there's the huge disappointment of ultimates. These have long cooldowns, like 60 seconds, and they have to compete with your other skill options to fit on your bar. And what's worse is they have very little payoff for those costs. Check out Rain of Arrows I'm using in this event here. The event's over before I can use it again, and even then it has almost no impact, and I had to sacrifice a far more useful skill, Caltrops, to use it. The edgily named Death Trap looks cool, but it isn't much better. The third and final ultimate, Shadow Clone, might have some potential, but it's still a hard sell versus other skills that you can use all the time. The biggest offense of Rogue's design is that legendaries and unique items will make the skills interesting. If Blizzard can manage to take such a boring set of base skills and really turn it around through legendary item effects, then I'll certainly be very impressed, and I really hope that that is the case. The ones I've found so far though, which is quite a few, seem to just add a small effect, like Dash has a smoke bomb at the end, or Blade Flurry has a bonus splash AoE, which is bugged and doesn't work by the way. Hopefully the higher level effects add some far more interesting things to the skills. One thing I did quite like about the Rogue, and I understand Barbarian has a similar feature, is the multiple weapon slots system. You can equip a bow and a pair of melee weapons, and your character automatically uses the appropriate weapon for the skill that you use. It's a brilliant dynamic system that I'd love to see other action RPGs use in the future. It's a shame that Rogue's skill design didn't do more with this concept though, it seems wasted. Like skills that use both slots, for example a melee strike that knocks back an enemy and then follows up with a bow finishing move. So now let's talk about build customization. Starting with the skill tree, you have your skill types divided up in sections across the tree. There's a free basic attack section, an energy spender main attack section, a couple of sets of cooldown skills for movement and utility, imbuements, which are damage buffs, and then your ultimates followed by a final passive capstone. Each skill has a node behind it, and then your choice of one of 2 competing nodes that add a small effect or scaling option. It's strange how each skill in Diablo 3 had 5 or 6 runes, but Diablo 4 only seems to have 2 per skill, and the ultimate skills in fact only have 1 option. There are also some passive nodes scattered around as well. Some of these are minor scaling options, but a few are more impactful, like heal on crit that I got, and reduce damage taken from poison enemies. You can also put more passives into the skill itself, skill levels, which gives a few % increased damage or slightly increases other effects like slow on caltrops or reduced cooldown on dash. Pretty minor boosts. Overall, it's a very simple and straightforward little skill tree. There are a couple of routes for customization here, but most of them play out themselves. For example, if you spec into skills that debuff enemies with vulnerability, then your later choices are between something that interacts with vulnerability or something that doesn't. So your choice is mostly made for you. You feel a little clever when you get heal on crit and then bonus crit when enemies are slowed by caltrops, but then you realize that's exactly what the devs intended you to do, and there wasn't really another option. Many argue that the Paragon system in Diablo 4 previews looks to have a lot more customization than Diablo 3 did, which I hope is true because the base skill tree doesn't offer too much. It's a lot of pressure to place on that Paragon system to carry so much of the burden of build creation though. I hope it can live up to expectations. On the other side of the equation is gearing. In Diablo 4, gear has a power rating, which scales base damage, or armor, and affix power. Gear power trumps everything initially, though as I got closer to level 25, some of the affixes started to have a bit more of an impact, so that I would sometimes wear a slightly lower gear power item that had better affixes, like for example movement speed or crit chance. Gear affixes are minor variants on the same things for the most part, main stats which give a small percentage increase to various stats such as armor or skill damage. There's actual armor itself, and various conditional damage increases like for example, bonus damage against a slowed enemy, a nearby enemy, or a far away enemy. It's all variants on that theme. It got a bit better as I got to level 25, so hopefully the upward trend on gear affix interest continues towards maximum level. Plus, skill levels was also present, which is fun when it unlocks a new skill for you early, but the excitement there is short-lived as the bonus for extra levels on skills is actually very tiny, like I showed before. Like a couple % increase in damage tiny. I don't really like the gear power system very much, as it means item bases really don't have any distinction or meaning. There's no real rusted dagger versus masterwork stiletto going on. It's just a 145 power level dagger versus a 192 power level dagger. Legendaries in Diablo 4 are kind of confusingly named. They're kind of rare plus items. There's actually a separate item type called uniques that isn't in the beta that sound more like what we're used to, items with unique preset affixes. Legendaries here though are rare items with an extra affix, which they either drop with or you craft onto them in town. These are where some of the skill customization is supposed to come from, so they tend to give some added effect to a skill. Though in some cases it's just something like attack speed. There's a range of interesting and uninteresting ones, but the actual system of customizing your rare items into legendaries is pretty cool. You take a rare item and put a legendary affix on it, which you unlock by completing the dungeons around the world. Or if you get a random legendary drop, you can destroy it and get a one-time use version where you can imprint a new item with that effect. I like this sort of customization layer a lot. It's a good motivation to do dungeons and it lets you engage with your gear more. Other gear customization options are the enchanting system, which allows you to replace one affix on an item with a random option, a basic reroll for just one modifier. This is a fine extra layer of customization. And then there's gem socketing, though gem effects are pretty boring on the whole, just the same as regular affixes you can get, so it's essentially just add one preset affix to each item. You can also upgrade the power level of each item a few times. This just lets you use a lower level item for a bit longer at a cost. These all act as a pretty good gold sink as well, worth mentioning, and gold actually felt quite valuable the entire beta. Everything costs quite a lot, but items also seem to sell for a decent amount too, but I was always broke. I'd say on the whole, gear customization as seen in the beta demo is actually a strength of the game. It's a far cry from most other action RPGs on the market, but in the context of Diablo 4 and in comparison to MMO-like games, it's a solid starting point. Hopefully it gets built upon at endgame as well. So, overall, here's my summary of my feelings and how it all comes together. Diablo 4 is, apart from a couple of glaring issues like the UI, a visually pleasing game. With, apart from some audio balancing issues, a pretty good audio experience. That has, apart from some very mundane skills, pretty good feeling combat. It offers some pretty rewarding challenges in dungeons and world bosses, though with some issues like a lack of variety in the former, and timers that might ruin your experience on the latter. Gearing is a bit mediocre on a base level, though redeemed through impactful crafting customization. And it has a skill tree character building that is very lacking, hopefully built upon by systems we haven't seen yet from higher levels. Diablo 4 is the definition of a mixed bag. And it's worth considering that it's a pretty expensive game that's quite likely to have quite a bit of microtransaction and battle pass, fear of missing out style type things on top for you to spend your cash on. It feels like a bit of a halfway point between Diablo 3 and Lost Ark, or perhaps Diablo Immortal meets Lost Ark in some ways. So hopefully, unlike those games, from what the developers have said, there won't be any pay-to-win elements and it'll stick with cosmetics. We'll have to wait and see. If you enjoy those previously mentioned games and just want to cruise around blowing up some monsters in a cool looking world, then you'll probably enjoy Diablo 4. But if you're hoping for something that improves upon Diablo 3's gameplay while taking the aesthetics back to the style and tone of Diablo 2, then you may be a little bit disappointed by the lacking skill options and character customization, oftentimes feeling like a step back from Diablo 3. I'll likely be revisiting some of the other classes next weekend and I'll see if my opinions change. But that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.